This week on To the Contrary.
As the U.S. slowly recovers from the pandemic, women are hit harder with economic and mental health challenges. Then, is it wise for the Catholic Church to deny communion to a pro-choice U.S. president?
Beyer. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, women, the pandemic, and the economy.
Businesses continue to reopen, with most Americans having had at least one dose of the COVID vaccine. But economic and mental health challenges persist, and they're tougher on women. Women lost more jobs than men during the pandemic, and as jobs come back, women lag behind men going back to work. Mental health issues have impacted all types of Americans, but women more so. A new Harvard poll of young adults shows the majority of young women feel down, depressed, or hopeless. And almost 3/4 of young women report feeling tired or lacking energy. With us today are the Center for Equal Opportunities Chair, Linda Chavez, former Maryland U.S. Representative Donna Edwards, Independent Women's Forum President Carrie Lukas, and Democratic strategist and cultural advocate Megan Beyer.
So, Donna Edwards, with young people depressed and women depressed, and how do we expect an economic recovery to happen?
That is why an economic recovery really has to focus on for whom the economy is recovering. And by that, I mean, what kinds of jobs are being created, who's being recruited for those jobs. And then, of course, drawing attention to the abhorrent lack of mental health services through so many communities, and particularly communities of color. And so I don't think there's going to be a strong economic recovery if we don't focus that recovery on women.
In order to have a very healthy economy, you have to have an expanding labor force. And we're running now into labor shortages, and women are part of that story. Women are finding that if they don't have adequate childcare, if their kids are not back in school, it's very difficult to go back into the workforce. And it is particularly so for women who are at the lower end of the economic scale. I mean, if you're wealthy enough and can afford to hire somebody to take care of your kids, that's one thing. But if you have to rely on daycare or the public schools to be your child care system, you're going to have a problem.
Well, but let me point out an oxymoron, because you just said that low-income women, they don't have, they don't have care for their children, but they also aren't going back to work. Well, they're never going to get anything for themselves or their children if they don't find a way to get back to work.
Well, I do think that's, I'm a conservative, and I don't like tons and tons of social programs funded by the taxpayers. But I think we do have to recognize schools, number one. This week, the head of the American Federation of Teachers announced that schools must reopen in the fall. And that is absolutely critical. That is, like it or not, it isn't just educating kids that schools do. It also takes care of them while their parents work. So that's number one. And number two, we do have to find a way to help parents be able to take care of their kids. I would rather have direct payments to parents, including single mothers, rather than just pouring more money into daycare, because I think that gives people more options, and they can choose family members, or they can perhaps end up finding that they are going to stay home more hours than they otherwise would.
Megan, your thoughts?
Well, Linda, I really appreciate that. I've been hearing a lot of people on the right talking about these people are getting checks. That's why they're not going back into the workforce. And I really don't think that's it at all. I think that the lack of scaffolding, and I might even use the word infrastructure, for the transfer of women out of the home into the workforce back to the 70s just never took place. All those things you're talking about, Linda, child care, the reality that people are taking care of their children. And if they're not taking care of their children, they're going to have to pay for something. And I love your idea of a payment per child for that. And luckily, it's sort of like a perfect storm. You hear that idea that you never want to let a good crisis go to waste and in politics. And this is the crisis that has exposed how dependent this economy is on women workers who were not, it's not even blaming the victim, it's blaming the heroes of this COVID crisis, where they were the frontline workers. They were the ones giving up the job, going home, taking care of the people who needed to be taken care of. Well, I hope that as we come out of it, we build back better. The Joe Biden platform is the perfect platform to put those things that Linda talked about in place.
Well, I think it's funny because I do think that a lot of the story of the pandemic and what's happened to women is that we have had the failure of the public schools. And I know here in Virginia, the private schools opened starting in September, and kids were back full time. And I sat here with 5 public school kids. I'm a proud public school parent. And my kids weren't allowed to go back until about a month ago. And the thing that I find funny at this point is that we are now talking about what a big part of the American Families Act, the proposal by the president, is to kind of double down on this K through 12 model that did such terrible damage to especially American women and those who don't have the luxury of opting out of public schools. I like the idea. I think we could take a lot of money that's right now being siphoned through the failing public school bureaucracy, give it to parents, empower parents so that they can know next time if we ever have another school closure, and we know our schools are desperate to close as soon as they can again, or there's a lot of pressure, schools are still being dragged forward and trying to open their doors. I don't want to have to depend on them again. Give me my money back. Give me some choices. Give me the same choices that people who right now are choosing private schools. Give us options. I think that's the key, and I think we can all get on board. Parents need help, but let's give it directly to the parents. Let's not have a big government bureaucracy act as the middleman.
Well, Megan, you referred to this, but would you say that Biden's $6 trillion budget, including infrastructure, which is redefining human beings as infrastructure, as you know,
well, the economy looks at human capital actually as an important asset, and anything that props up the economy, I would say human capital is a big piece of that.
Right, but he is doing something quietly revolutionary here and changing the definition of programs that, social service programs that are so widely decried by parts of the voting bloc, and calling them part of the infrastructure.
Well, is there
any way his $6 trillion package is going to get through the Senate?
There's a lot of talk about breaking it down. Donna would probably know better those kinds of questions, but let's get a little perspective on this. We're the only industrialized nation in the world that doesn't have paid maternity leave, that doesn't have paid family leave. These are the things Joe Biden is talking about. And then by bringing the age of public school down to 3, that helps the problem of the child care issue. And then some support for finding child care. He's simply doing things, I think, retroactively. I mean, they should have been done when we all so earnestly joined the workforce and believed that it was going to be a wholesome thing for our families, because that's what we were told. And it's not, I'll do a both sides on you. It wasn't just the Republicans. It was, remember when Clinton did, welfare reform, it was supposed to have transportation, job training, and childcare. And we never fulfilled those parts of it. He dickered that away in the sausage making, and we always thought we'd come back to it. Well, we never did. So to me, those things are not these extras. And we ought to remember too, when they say people are not working because they're getting these checks, the checks are $300 a week. And a lot of those jobs are restaurant jobs. And you have to remember there's a a tip wage of $2 an hour. And that
in
is
some states,
in some states. I know
Louisiana
where I
is the
was a
worst, I
waitress.
believe.
but you know, a lot of those restaurant jobs depend on tips. And if you don't have people, you don't have tips. And if you're doing carry out, you don't have tips. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons and factors that come with, you know, a once in a lifetime pandemic that characterize this economic downturn.
Okay, and Linda, your thoughts on defining people as infrastructure?
Well, there's certainly a case to be made that people are our main capital. That human capital is all about people, and they are necessary in order to have a thriving economy. But I'm going to throw out something that I'm sure you're not going to agree with, Bonnie, and others may not as well. And that is that, you know, some women may decide that it makes more sense for them to stay home, but we absolutely need to expand our workforce. And the only way to do that is by fixing immigration and allowing people to come here legally to work. And if we were to do that, we could expand the labor force. It would not solve our women back in the labor force problem, but I think women should be given a choice. And even poor mothers, yes, it's great to have the role model of somebody going to work, but in some instances, I think women should be able to choose to stay home, to get support if they want to go back into the workforce, to be able to hire family members, community members, not necessarily to go to a big daycare center that's federally funded.
The reality is that most people who either choose to go to work or want to work get their daycare actually not from family members. They do get it in a more organized structure. And the fact is that the lack of daycare was a problem, a big problem pre-pandemic, and it is a bigger problem now. And you know, when daycare costs run, you know, sometimes in many states, like in my home state of Maryland, the average cost of daycare actually is more than the average cost of a public education in college. And so families are really suffering under that. And it may be the reason that some people actually do choose, women choose to stay home versus going out into the labor force. And I do think that the American Families Plan, I mean, the part of it, I think, that is really most attractive is the fact that it connects what you described, Linda, the human capital, to the hardened capital. I say hardware and software, to make sure that you can get the entire project done. And so that women have the ability to get trained into some of these unconventional job opportunities that are going to come with rebuilding the nation's infrastructure. You can't get that unless women feel comfortable in where their child is going to be taken care of during the day while they're working, or on a third shift when they're working in some of those construction jobs. And we have to do all of that because, you know, you can't leave out half of our human capital in terms of women outside of the economy and a recovering 21st century economy. And then finally, I would say, Linda, you are spot on. We can't have this conversation outside of the context of significant immigration reform so that we can begin to expand our labor force.
Well, I challenge either one of you to show me a year since the 1950s when the US population has dropped.
We grew at the slowest rate in the census that we have at any time since the 1930s. We need workers, and the population is aging. We now have only 3.4 persons in the labor force to take care of those people who are out of the labor force.
Here's one problem that we have going into the recovery, which is people getting vaccinated. Even though lots of people in this country have had not just one, but 2 shots, and are fully vaccinated and beyond the 2-week period that you have to wait to be fully inoculated, there's still millions and millions of Americans who haven't gotten vaccinated. What do we do with those people? How do we get them vaccinated short of, give them, a 6-pack of beer. It's
Well,
worked in some states.
if I can, I think it's insulting to, I just actually got my second vaccination this morning, and I'm a big supporter in people getting vaccinated, but I think it's a cheap shot to say, oh, I'll give them a 6-pack of beer. There are
No,
people.
I'm just saying that's what one state did. And it worked really well.
Well, it's funny. I feel like one of the things we need to start doing is how about having a rational conversation to actually say, you don't have to keep masking once you're vaccinated. You don't have to stay 6 feet apart when you're vaccinated. We now have this zero tolerance for risk. And it's funny. And I feel like I, again, want to harp on this idea of I think the conversation we were supposed to be having was about getting women back into the workforce. And I think this, like, one of the big things, and why women are so depressed, why the country is so depressed, part of it is because we've become this incredibly risk intolerant. You're not, if you're a grandparent, you're not supposed to go near your child, even if you've been vaccinated at this point. You're not allowed to have like a party. You're not allowed to. No wonder people are depressed, because they're sitting there watching Netflix and watching the depressing news all the time, instead of doing those things that, having social interaction. And I blame, I think, the CDC, and all of those who've kept children, especially. You think about, I'm, again, a mother of 5, I've got teenage kids, and I think what's happened to teenagers has been completely cruel over the last year. To children, I think, has been cruel and crazy and not based on science. The idea that my 6-year-old son is still wearing a mask and is not allowed to play on a playground, not allowed to touch another child when there is essentially zero risk of COVID for any of these children. The idea that we should empower another 2 years of people who I think don't care about, totally did not prioritize children's mental health, educational health, particularly low-income parents. They couldn't care less. So I feel like it's crazy to think about expanding government's role in educating our kids. I also hope that Americans will say to themselves, we'll never give up this much freedom again, because I do think good liberals should think that too.
Can I say something?
Sure.
We have a new administration, and they set out with a very, very aggressive goal on getting shots in arms. It's completely changed the environment. And yes, it did involve a few rules that, we're used to being called snowflakes, but I really have to giggle at these like big men who are like just so upset about wearing a mask. I'm like, you guys, we're all for one. Let's just pull together. It's a crisis. We're Americans. Let's be a little generous and let's listen to the science. And I find that there's a feeling of optimism now, because we have tangible proof that we have made the science, what the scientists tell us will do, progress in this pandemic. And to be there criticizing every decision a policymaker makes, if you're not, I happen to be married to one. So, I take it a little personally. They're doing the best they can. And I know Donna, when she was in Congress, did the best she could. It's a terrible crisis. And to be sitting there second guessing every decision, at least decisions are being made. Under Trump, he denied it was happening. He said it would go away. He promoted false narratives. So I'm actually very grateful.
Okay.
Which is funny. We started out talking about the mental health crisis.
From women and the pandemic to the Pope.
The Vatican has warned U.S. bishops not to rush into plans to condemn Catholic politicians who support the right to abortion. American bishops are considering sending a message to President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, and other pro-choice Catholics, telling them they should not receive communion if they continue to support abortion rights. The U.S. bishops are divided. The Vatican has warned them not to move ahead unless they are unanimous. The Vatican also questioned whether abortion should be labeled as the preeminent moral issue, as U.S. bishops have labeled it.
Megan, you've left the Catholic Church for reasons kind of similar to this. Tell us about it.
Well, when my husband ran for office, both of us had been to Catholic schools for 13 years. And, it just became very punishing. There was a parish here in Alexandria where they were putting notes on cars of people who were in office and telling them that they, couldn't take communion. And then I was at a picnic.
And that was a long time ago, right?
Oh, yeah. This was a 1993. And then another time I was at a picnic, and I had, a priest chased me off the property of just what was a community picnic. It was on church grounds, and like I was some kind of pariah because I was, obviously supporting a Democratic candidate. So I remember when John Kennedy ran for president, and everyone was so afraid that he would bring, he'd be serving the Vatican. And he talked a lot about the separation of church and state, and how, the church has a 501c3 status. And of course, it would never want to imperil that tax exempt status by getting involved in politics. This is so far beyond that now. And it's obvious that the Pope understands the danger on many, many levels, because he has come out against it.
The Vatican is clearly acting more liberal than the US bishops at this point, which is just shocking to me, because talking about Kennedy and many later years, for years after that, the American bishops and prelates were much more liberal than the Vatican, and it's all switched. Is that because of two popes again? We started with two conservative popes, and now all of a sudden we have a liberal pope, and who they're appointing as bishops?
I think it does come from the top. And I think that this Pope, there was a book written about Kennedy where Kennedy once said, listen, I campaign with the nuns. Believe me, if there were no nuns, this would be a very Republican, the Catholic Church would be very, very Republican. And he said, the nuns are the ones that are all about social justice, the acts of Christ, Mother Teresa working for the poor. They were obsessed with poverty and alleviating pain. And then in the 70s, when other religions gave women a path to leadership, the Catholic Church decided not to allow women to become priests. And, we lost a lot of the nuns. And I do think the character of the church has changed.
All right, others jump in on this, please.
Yeah, let me just jump in on this, because I think one of the things we're missing here is that the Catholic Church has a belief in individual conscience. And I think one of the things the Pope is saying is that it should not be up to others to judge the conscience of someone who believes themselves to be a faithful Catholic and takes communion. I think that's really good. I don't want other people trying to get inside our leaders' consciences, and God judges. And I think that bishops trying to make others sort of an example and trying to force others to publicly state what they believe, I think violates the rule of conscience and the individual conscience.
Well, is it not also, Donna Edwards, about filling the pews? Because as we all know, in Europe, where women are by and large much better educated, they have more postgraduate degrees than we do here on average, the pews are emptying out. And so this is one more push that the conservative prelates want to make, that the Pope must be wondering, how many millions of Catholics am I going to push out of the religion if they go forward with this, denying communion to observant and faithful Catholic politicians?
Well, and this Pope has been so much more focused on Catholic social teaching, and on that being those being the guiding principles of how he relates to Catholics around the world. And I think that here in the United States, I think, as you said, the past two popes have been way more conservative. There are a lot of conservative bishops, and the Catholic Church in the United States was already hemorrhaging people because of this sort of rigidity. And I think that Meghan is one example, but there are so many millions of others around the world who are just leaving the Catholic Church, not because they're leaving their God, not because they're leaving their faith, but because they're leaving this rigidity of the church. And I think it is an example of what can happen when a church is trying to do, as Linda has said, which is get into leaders' heads as opposed to looking at their deeds and letting one's own conscience be the guide. Even as a candidate, I was run off of Catholic Church grounds, even when invited by nuns are invited by parishioners because of my support for abortion rights. And so this even goes beyond just Catholic elected officials, but is becoming rampant in the United States. And I just don't think it's sustainable.
And can I say one thing?
Carrie, final thoughts on this topic.
That's okay. I'll let Megan speak. I'm not a Catholic, so I'll let you guys with more knowledge on this talk it out.
Oh, well, I've just heard everybody I know is saying, Joe Biden could bring me back to the church. And so, because I really think he's a weekly communicant, if not more. He's always showing such Christ-like interest in the poor and people who need help. And so that's the irony. And he's the one that want to give communion to now.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Carrie Lukas. I have to say that in 30 years of doing this program, I think you're the first person who ever ceded your time to another panelist. So
Thank you.
Was very, very, very polite of you. Thank you so much. We love that. That's it for this edition. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary. Be more. PBS.